like to thank the World IP Forum organizers for inviting me to present today. I'll be talking about Open Invention Network, which is the largest patent non-aggression community in the history of the tech sector. It is a global community made up of some of the most significant companies in terms of size, as well as a very significant number of small, medium-sized enterprises who are also participants in the community. The fundamental basis of OIN from its foundation 15 years ago has been the notion of creating freedom of action and freedom to operate for companies in the open source world who are adopting or seeking to adopt open source code and utilize it to enable their products and offerings in the marketplace. Open source is something that isn't necessarily branded as such, but it's present all around us. Pretty much every electronic touch we have is Linux and open source software enabled. As software rises, a disproportionate percentage of software that we see is in fact open source. Every electronic touch, as I said, whether it be through a ATM machine, through a mobile payment that we might make, through every Google search, every Chromebook that we use, every computer, in fact, has, whether it be a handset, mobile device, or a fixed computer, is running some level of open source code. Autonomous driving programs and platforms are developed around open source. So as they start to become more prevalent, we will see open source being central to the safe operation of autonomous vehicles. Every light that we cross at, air traffic control systems, the trading platforms, be it the Mumbai Exchange or the New York Stock Exchange or any of the others that exist, are run on Linux and open source. All the cloud providers, whether it be Amazon or any of the others globally, are utilizing key open source code to be able to create their platforms and support their service offerings. As I said, software is on the rise. Very few companies will be defining themselves as hardware companies 5 years from now, as software becomes increasingly central to the operation of a successful operation of companies that previously were hardware companies as they move forward into the future. The model or modality that underlies open source is incredibly important in becoming a source of litigation, a source of innovation and inventiveness. Collaborative and global is really the catchphrases, and we're moving away from siloed and bounded invention environments. We're inventing and building on top of each other's ideas. This whole idea of collaborative development is giving rise to new novelty in ways that we could not possibly have developed if we're all individually looking to develop and duplicating effort. Open source has really opened a portal into the whole notion of collaborative, innovative approaches to technology development. You have more contributors, and it drives higher degrees of inventiveness, and you don't have people that have to be physically located in Silicon Valley or in Route 128 in Boston, or in Sophia Antipolis in the south of France, or in any place in India or Japan or wherever else in the world. It's location independent. And as a result, we're gaining higher levels of innovation. This innovation happens through really what I'm calling the idea of project-based innovation or project-based collaboration. Entities like the Linux Foundation, Apache, and Eclipse, and many other organizations that are managing projects professionally are organizing groups of companies that have common interests in the auto sector, in the IoT sector, in networking and telecommunications, in power and energy, and blockchain, financial services. All manner of companies are coming together to collaborate in order to compete more effectively. The whole notion of co-opetition, which was first talked about in the 90s, is actually coming to fruition in a new and exciting way. It's not just joint ventures and collaborative development, but development among hundreds, if not thousands, of companies in each project that are supporting the development of important code that can be adopted. And so I think it's important also to note for people that this idea of co-opetition and the emergence of open source doesn't mean that we are losing the value, the value and the contribution to innovation that comes from intellectual property. Rather, we're just looking at different ways of utilizing intellectual property and being more precise about how it's used and where it's used to be able to derive innovation. And so it's really a form of practice duality where we're working in an increasingly open source-centric world, but we're also supporting at the same time a sense of where proprietary actually plays and where innovation can occur through the through patenting and the protection of inventions. And so it's really about changing the mindset of the stewards of intellectual property at IP departments across the world to have them understand how patents can be used in a more creative, thoughtful, and cost-effective way when we actually are living in a more open source-centric environment. And Open Invention Network, as I mentioned at the outset, is an entity that was really created 15 years ago as a vehicle to be able to deal with, at that point, a very significant monolithic threat in the form of Microsoft. Now, in the last 2 years, Microsoft has recognized the importance of open source to its success going forward, and has become part of the Open Invention Network community and has thereby exposed its 60,000+ patents to cross-license insofar as those patents read on critical open source functionality that everyone needs to be able to standardize on. And we're really describing this as since that time, it's really, we've been pivoting to focus less on operating company risk and more on non-practicing entity risk. As the risk has shifted, patents have come from operating companies or from universities or other sources to be able to be purchased by financial speculators who are in the non-practicing entity arena, patent assertion entity arena, who are now utilizing those patents as a vehicle to try and extract rents from the open source community. This is a growing trend and something that we have been working for the last 2 years since Microsoft came on board to be able to focus on becoming as effective as we've been against operating company risk over the last 15 years to focus more on non-practicing entity risk. The original foundation of OIN was an act of leadership by IBM, Red Hat, Novell, Sony, NEC, and Philips. Since that time, Google and Toyota have joined OIN as founding and funding members. OIN right now has 3,400 community members, companies that are pledged their patents and to participate in a cross-license that we maintain, where we collaborate and where we rely on code that we want to create commonly accessible across all platforms and all projects. We don't sue each other. Everywhere else, the normal rules around intellectual property and innovation apply. But it's really just focusing on creating a patent no-fly zone around the core of open source and Linux project code. We have essentially 3 million patents that are held by the 3,400 companies that are exposed to the cross-license. A percentage of those being actually in the cross-license, but all of them are exposed when a participant becomes part of the community. We have We own over 1,100 patents and applications, and we have spent over $100 million in developing our patent portfolio through acquisition and inventing activities. And we have created a scope called the Linux System Definition of core Linux technology packages and other adjacent open source project code that ultimately serves as the functionality contained in that code forms the basis for the cross-license zone or the patent no-fly zone. And it's important that this is very much a global program. This is not about doing something for large countries or large companies only. This is about creating inclusivity, large and small companies alike, large and small countries alike, and countries all around the world, because of the rapid spread and utilization of open source. We're supporting every region in the world, every continent, and to be able to create this sense of community. What we're really building through this Linux system definition and the cross-license and engaging people is this notion of community, so that we're ultimately developing a set of norms that people can operate by in terms of how they utilize intellectual property, particularly patents, in an increasingly open source-centric world, and how they do so in a healthy and authentic way. To develop the kind of the zone of non-aggression and choosing the code that we want to be able to utilize to be a part of this Linux system definition, we work with all manner of professional organizations that are managing open source projects, whether it be the OpenStack Foundation, Eclipse, Linux Foundation, Apache, or the quite new Open Atom Foundation, which was formed last year in China. So we really live in the slipstream of the projects that these organizations manage, and we work with the technical leads, the technical directors of all of the key projects that are out there, and there are literally hundreds of key projects that we support. We work with those organizations to identify entities that we can code that we can bring in that should represent what's important in open source. This is just a representative sample of some of the companies that are in the community. Some of them are some of the largest and most sophisticated companies in the world. Obviously, banking is growing in terms of open source adoption, automotive in a very significant way, and semiconductor, hardware, industrials, the power sector, consumer electronics. If we look at, there's obviously in information technology services where Indian companies have a very significant global market share. We see most, if not all, of the major players listed there, media and entertainment. And essentially what OIN does, in addition to having this cross-license that it maintains and grows over time to be able to keep pace with the growth of Linux, we are very active in supporting companies that are at risk or in litigation by identifying prior art that we can deliver to a company in such a situation to allow them to use it with their counsel to be able to maintain some kind of ability to be able to manage the risk associated with litigation. We ensure that people through the cross-license have comfort adopting open source code. There's no cost in the engagement of OIN and participation in its cross-license. And we have emerged as a litmus test of authenticity in the open source community. Companies essentially that don't agree to participate and support the OIN license and community are generally companies that are wishing to reserve the right to sue on core Linux and open source functionality. And every month, every year, fewer and fewer companies are holding out, and more companies are becoming part of our community. I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today and for your attention. and look forward to interacting with you either by email or at an event once we're in a post-COVID environment and I can once again visit you in India or elsewhere in the world.